Welcome everyone to our webinar on direct pay. I'm Sarah Beal. I'm the Policy Director at the Ohio Mayor's Alliance, and I'm co-hosting here today with Cassandra Clevenger and the team from Power Clean Future Ohio. So you may have come here through one of our or both of our organizations, and we're thrilled to have you. I'm going to just quickly introduce our two guests and then let them get started. We are recording the video today, the presentation. We are planning to turn off the recording before the Q&A, so you can feel free to speak freely, but we want to have the information available so if folks can't join us, they can watch it later. If you wouldn't mind, it would be really helpful to our speakers if you could put your name and the city you're from in the chat so we can get a sense of who's on the call. And I will go ahead and introduce David Eichenthal, who is a senior advisor for policy implementation with the Biden administration and at the Department of Treasury. David has extensive experience working on these issues, tax credits, and the IRA. I had a great conversation with him earlier this year after connecting, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from him. We also have Dr. Teresa Lawrence, who is the Director of State, Local, Tribal, and Territorial Policy at the US Department of Energy in the Office of Policy at DOE. So she's, again, extremely experienced, extremely knowledgeable about community-driven plans that support transitions to clean and equitable and resilient energy sources. So I think we're in really good hands today. And my daughter is standing behind me. But I will mute myself and turn it over to our speakers.
Hey, Sarah, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Appreciate everyone's time in joining today. Particularly pleased to be joined by my colleague, Teresa Lawrence, from the Department of Energy. I think the two of us are trying to deliver a 1-2 punch around direct pay. So Teresa is incredibly expert on the underlying technology where investments are going to qualify for direct pay or elective pay. I'm more speaking to this from the perspective that I have of spending about 30 years or so working in and with local governments on budget and finance issues, including a number of the jurisdictions in Ohio. So it's really great to be talking to a number of folks from the state of Ohio today. Cassandra, I think we could start with the deck. Share that.
I'm going to pull that up for you right now.
Thank you. So I'll start talking about it as it comes up. There it goes. So you go to the first slide. So this is the requisite slide, which is a disclaimer. I'm not going to be giving you any tax advice or tax guidance today. The presentation, however, is based on guidance and other information that is available on the IRA website. It's also a number of things available on the Treasury Department website, and we'll provide a bunch of those resources at the end of the presentation. You go to the next slide. So the Inflation Reduction Act is the largest investment in clean energy in U.S. history. And I've heard a number of people say that it may very well be the largest government investment in clean energy in anyone's history. And one of the things that's interesting about the Inflation Reduction Act, and really sort of central to the presentation this afternoon, is that much of that investment comes in the way of tax incentives. So there are certainly a number of different grant programs that are being funded by the Inflation Reduction Act. Teresa may be able to talk about some of those with respect to the Department of Energy as we dig in further on the presentation. But the reason I'm here from the Treasury Department is because the bulk of the investments in the Inflation Reduction Act, when it comes to clean energy, are coming in the form of tax incentives. And the Treasury Department is the federal agency responsible for administering the tax code. The Inflation Reduction Act includes about 20 different provisions related to the tax code, and creates a number of different incentives designed to support a clean energy economy. And the private sector, which benefits from a number of those tax incentives, has really been going gangbusters, if you will, in terms of taking up those incentives with tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars in investments since the adoption, or commitments to investment since the adoption of the Inflation Reduction Act at the end of 2022. But part of the way that the Inflation Reduction Act was designed, with this focus on tax incentives and tax credits, was we absolutely are counting on the private sector to play a critical role in this transition. We're counting on individual consumers. Think about residents in your cities, your counties, going out and putting solar on top of solar panels on top of their home, or purchasing electric vehicles. But the idea was to really level the playing field so that all sectors can play the role that they need to play in order to drive forward with this transition, in order to meet some of the goals around addressing environmental and climate related issues. So elective pay, direct pay, is really the mechanism by which not just the private sector, not just individual consumers, but non-tax-paying entities like local governments, like the nonprofit sector, can begin to take advantage of these credits as well, so that they could make necessary investments in clean energy transition. Cassandra, you could go to the next slide. So that's really the difference here, right? So that I know that when I have these conversations with local government officials, the immediate reaction for many who aren't familiar with the IRA, they sort of say, wait a minute, why are you talking to me about tax credits? I'm from a local government. I'm not a business. I don't pay taxes. What do tax credits do for me? And it's because of this novel provision of the Inflation Reduction Act, sometimes called elective pay, sometimes called direct pay, that there is this opening to the same incentives that the private sector and individual consumers enjoy. There is an opening to local government to take advantage and benefit from those incentives as well. And in terms of what this means for local government, I know we're all used to, I used to be a city finance officer. I was used to writing long, good grant proposals in response to long notices of funding opportunity for the federal government. And it was great when we won the grant, and less great when we didn't win the grant. Direct pay is not a grant in the sense it's not a competitive grant program. Basically, if you meet the requirements for eligibility for elective pay, which again, most local governments, most local government agencies do, and you meet the underlying requirements of the tax credit itself, you get the money, right? So, and we'll talk about the degree to which it's an uncapped funding source, it's a sustainable funding source, but fundamentally, it is different from a competitive grant program in that way. And the process for accessing these credits is pretty straightforward. Congress mandated a two-step process whereby there is a first step of a pre-filing registration, so that for projects for clean energy properties, you get a specific registration number for that project or property, and then you file a tax return. And then, assuming you filed everything correctly, you receive the value of the credit. You could go to the next slide. So again, as I think I mentioned, it's local governments that are applicable entities. It's agencies and instrumentalities of state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. So that includes school districts, it includes public hospitals, it includes public higher education. I guess I saw that there were a number of land bank entities. I think it depends on the structure of the land bank in your jurisdiction. But I'd note also that tax-exempt organizations, most nonprofit organizations, are eligible for direct or elective pay. And in some situations in Ohio, if there are rural electric cooperatives in your jurisdiction, they are eligible as well. So I think I mentioned the fact that there are some 20 so provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act that deal with tax credits, tax provisions. I'm sorry, I don't know if other people are seeing the screen move along, but I'm not seeing the next slide up. But of those 20 or so provisions related to the tax code that are part of the Inflation Reduction Act, there are about a dozen of them that direct pay applies to. And they really fall into four different categories. So the first category is really around, for lack of a better phrase, it's really focused on energy generation and carbon capture. And there are a number of different direct pay. There are a number of different tax credits related to that. The two that tend to be the most of interest to local governments have to do with the production tax credit and the investment tax credit. And generally speaking, I'll talk more about how these apply to specific projects. If you're creating energy, right? If you're producing energy, think about solar panels, or think about wind, or think about creating using geothermal to heat a facility. If you're doing that, there are credits available either based on the amount of energy that's being produced, production tax credit, or the amount of money that you've invested in the property, the investment tax credit. The second sort of set, you go to the next slide, the second set category, if you will, of tax credits where direct pay is applicable have to do with manufacturing. And some people may think, well, you know, that really doesn't have to do with me as a city or a town or a county, but I know that many of you may have industrial parks that are part of your economic development portfolio. So it's certainly worth thinking about whether either of the two manufacturing credits, the Advanced Energy Project Credit or the Advanced Manufacturing Production Credit, whether those potentially apply to your local government. There are also two credits related to fuels, both the Clean Hydrogen Production Tax Credit and then beginning in 2025, the Clean Fuel Production Credit, which is basically technology neutral. And then the final category has to do with vehicles. And in many respects, these may be the two tax credits that most local governments around the country are at least focusing on first. I think there was a survey done by the Menino Institute a couple of years ago where a bunch of mayors were asked sort of their perspectives on the clean energy transition. And about 3/4 of the mayors who were responding basically acknowledged, yes, there are going to be changes in the composition of our local government fleet. We understand that, and we know we need to get ready for that. Well, there is both a credit for the purchase of qualified commercial clean vehicles. It's up to $7,500 for smaller vehicles. So think of a sedan that you might buy for a building inspector to go around in, and up to $40,000 for larger vehicles. So a month or so ago, I was in Phoenix, Arizona with the mayor there. We were meeting with the school district that had gone out and purchased a school bus that was an electric vehicle. And then also in the vehicles category, you've got the alternative fuel vehicle refueling property credit, which is another way of talking about charging stations and charging property. And there's a credit involved there. We can go to the next slide. So in addition to these specific tax credit provisions, so remember, direct pay is the mechanism that allows local government to access these tax credits. Then there are these 12 individual credits that local governments can seek direct pay under. There are also a number of bonus provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. And as you'll see in a second, I hope, these are really important. And they really have a significant impact on the amount of financial assistance the federal government can provide. So the first of these bonus provisions relates to requirements around prevailing wage and apprenticeship. There is also a bonus provision related to domestic content. Domestic content is particularly important because for projects or facilities beginning construction starting in 2024, the domestic content requirement can also result in a reduction of the production tax credit or investment tax credit if it's not met. There's an energy communities bonus, which is based on location of a project or a facility in an energy community. And we can talk a little bit about what qualifies for this bonus, but it's certainly projects located in historical energy communities. It's also available to brownfield sites. So a more expansive eligibility for the energy communities bonus with respect to the ITC and PTC. And then finally, there is a low-income communities bonus credit program. This is something whereas generally these tax credits are not part of a competition, the low-income community bonus credit is subject to an allocation so that you actually do have to submit an application in order to get it. You go to the next slide. So how does this all begin to play out when you're looking at very real examples? And I think that it's very, very important, particularly I know that there are probably some folks from auditor offices and finance directors' offices here to really begin to think through what this means in terms of penciling out certain different types of projects. So as I said, fleet replacement, changing of the composition of the local government fleet, in many respects, that's the most straightforward, right? So if you're buying one sedan, 10 sedans or 100 sedans, you get a tax credit of up to $7,500 per vehicle. And remember, there's a cap on the amount per vehicle, but there's no cap on the number of times you take that credit. So you could be replacing one vehicle at a time, or for some reason, you could be replacing your entire fleet. Again, that's true for the $40,000 credit for larger vehicles. The 30% credit on investment in eligible EV charging equipment is dependent upon meeting prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. But when you start to look at bigger projects projects more related to clean energy generation, thinking about solar, about microgrids, thinking about geothermal systems. When you start to look at all of those different types of opportunities, the numbers become, I think, particularly attractive and interesting, right? So let's hypothetically talk about $1 million project to do a solar farm with 1.1 megawatts of output. Well, if you were to look at that for the purposes of an investment tax credit, that $1 million project, right off the top, you would be eligible to get $60,000 back through direct pay and through the investment tax credit, which is good. You don't have to compete for it, so that's good. But remember, I talked about the significance of those bonuses. For a project of that size, for a project over 1 megawatt in output, if you meet the prevailing wage and registered apprenticeship requirements, that 6% investment tax credit immediately becomes a 30% investment tax credit. So all of a sudden, that $60,000 becomes $300,000. If you layer on top of that the fact that you're meeting the requirement for domestic content, that's another 10%. If you're locating it in an energy community, that's another 10%. So all of a sudden, that $1 million solar farm, where the city or the county or a school district was trying to figure out, where am I going to come up with $1 million for that project? Well, half of the project is now covered by dollars that could come back through direct pay. You go to the next slide. And I think that's particularly important, right? Because you could go, there we go. Because of a problem that I know, nope, one more back. Because of a problem that I know that I always faced when I was working with local governments, which is how to think about what you're investing in from a capital perspective, right? And you know that there are different projects or different investments that you could make that have a recurring benefit in terms of operating savings. But it's sometimes hard to find the dollars for those projects, even though the ROI over a period of time is really attractive. And when you look at some of the different types of projects, and Teresa could talk a little bit about the Department of Energy's work looking at some of the potential cost savings here. When you look at things like fleet electrification, when you look at moving to solar, when you look at moving to geothermal, there are oftentimes real sustainable operational savings related to those investments. And the great thing about direct pay is it's all of a sudden this new additional source of financing that could go toward these projects. So there's both an immediate benefit of just lowering the capital cost, but then there's this ongoing potential benefit in many cases of reducing recurring operating costs, which again, you know, from a finance director's perspective, you know, is as close to the holy grail in terms of what you're looking for as possible. And those are precisely the sorts of investments that direct pay is designed to support. Cassandra, you go to the next one now. So another great benefit of direct pay is, you know, for those of us who've been focused on the bipartisan infrastructure law and American Rescue Plan over the last couple of years, I think we've all heard quite a lot, right, about blending and braiding and how do you mix and match different funding sources for different projects. Well, the tax code makes direct pay blending and braiding friendly. So the final rule has a provision that allows entities to combine grants and forgivable loans with the tax credits, so that if you receive a grant that pays part of the cost of acquiring qualified clean vehicles or for charging equipment, you could still file for direct pay, file for the underlying tax credit for that investment, and the basis would include the dollars from the grant. The regulation around this from a tax code perspective is you can't get a combination of tax credit plus grant that exceeds the actual cost of the investment. You go to the next slide. So, as Treasury and the IRS released the final rule around direct pay in March, there had been preliminary guidance around direct pay in June of 2023. And one of the, I would say, two major changes from what was issued in June of 23 to what was issued in March of 24 has to do with the determination of the tax year. And I'm happy to answer more specific questions during the question and answer session. But generally speaking, projects going into service after January 1 of 2023 were, projects where the taxable year began on or after January 1 of 2023 were eligible to file for tax credits and file under direct pay. The problem, and this is particularly a problem for a number of local governments, was that typically there was a definition of taxable year for it to mean fiscal year, which raises the question of, wait a minute, I put a project in March of 2023, but my fiscal year, the first fiscal year beginning after January of 2023 doesn't start until July, assuming a July through June fiscal year. Can I still claim the credit for that project? And what Treasury and the IRS did in the final rules was to make it clear that despite the association between taxable year and fiscal year that traditionally is the case, for first-time filers, like most local governments, there was a choice so that you could, even though your fiscal year was July through June, you could file a taxable year January through the end of December to make sure that you were able to file under direct pay. The other big change that was announced at the time of the final rule in March really wasn't with respect, I'm sorry, Cassandra, you go to the next slide, really wasn't with respect to the direct pay rule itself. It had to do with a proposed new rule that goes to the question of co-ownership. So if you look at the underlying guidance, if you look at a lot of the frequently asked questions around direct pay, the key to being able to claim the credit has to do with the ownership of the property, of the project, of the facility. And a number of local governments and state governments had actually come in and said, well, what if we co-own it? What if there are two government entities that each own part of it? What if I co-own a project with a non-applicable entity, in other words, a tax-paying entity? Can I still claim a portion of the credit? And the proposed rule lays out co-ownership options that are designed to provide that flexibility. The rule is still subject to public comment, and obviously we welcome those comments. Next slide. So how does this actually work practically? And I have a feeling, just sort of seeing some of the entities, some of the cities, counties on the call, that a number of you are sort of in this process right now, that you've had projects and you're in the position of seeking direct pay. But for everyone, the first step in this, right, is to identify and pursue the actual project or activity. And what I like to tell people is that the starting point for that really isn't the tax code. The starting point is your climate action plan or your sustainability plan or your capital plan, and taking a hard look at some of the projects that you've identified, and then looking to the tax code to see if any of the 12 relevant tax credit provisions under direct pay are potential sources of funding for that project. It also allows you, and we've heard about government entities that have done this, to go back and look at projects where you said, boy, I'd really love to do this project, but I can't quite figure out how to pencil it out. I can't quite figure out how to put the dollars together to make it work. Well, direct pay in those cases is sometimes a means of making those projects work that otherwise didn't. The next step sounds obvious, but but I'm sure folks will have questions about it. So you have to actually complete the project and put it into service. So this is not about getting money at the front end of the project. You actually have to finish the project and put it into service. And we could talk about what that means in terms of the need for upfront financing and bridge financing during the question and answer period. Once you put it into service, you could then determine which tax year it falls into and figure out when you actually need to complete the pre-filing registration that I talked about with the IRS. And then you file your tax return by the due date. So for a calendar year entity, the due date is typically 5 months into the year. It's a May 15th date. There is a provision where you get an extension on that due date. The extension's automatically granted, but you actually have to ask for it. Obviously, the extension is valuable in the sense that you need additional time to complete the filing. It does potentially delay when you would get the payment because you've extended the due date. And then finally, you receive the payment after the return is processed. Now, one of the really helpful things that I think the IRS did in issuing the final rule is to answer the question that I had received from a number of folks, which is like, well, what does that mean? Does that mean I'm going to get the payment 2 days later, 2 weeks later, 2 months later, or 2 years later? What the IRS basically said in the frequently asked questions around direct pay was, we're going to treat people who are filing under direct pay the way we would treat every other taxpayer. Assuming that they've gone through the pre-filing registration and appropriately filed, we expect to treat their payments on credits in much the same way we would with any taxpayer. It's reasonable to assume it could be 45 days. It could be less, it could be a little bit more, but it's an answer to the 2-day, 2-week, 2-month, 2-year question. You can go to the next slide. With respect to pre-filing, there's actually a very detailed user guide that's available on the IRS website. You can see the link here that really goes step by step through the pre-filing process. I should mention, by the way, that if people are in the pre-filing process, are in the process right now of either pre-filing or beginning to file, the IRS has been great about doing office hours and addressing some specific questions. If folks have questions about those, how to access that, I'm happy to address that as well. You go to the next one. And just more generally, I think the IRS, Treasury, the White House, Teresa could probably add 6 links from the Department of Energy site. I think there has just been a tremendous amount of information that's put out on this with a real goal of trying to be as helpful and as flexible as possible. I think there is a great desire on the part of the administration to make sure that local governments are aware of the opportunity, and B, as they're pursuing these projects, they have as much information as needed. I will say I'm really thrilled to be doing this webinar for Ohio. But if there are individual cities who are really trying to think this out, individual counties, other applicable entities that are interested, we have done numerous one-on-ones. I think I've seen a couple of folks from some of the Ohio cities where we've had those one-on-one conversations. Hopefully, that's part of the reason you're on this webinar, to keep learning about it, to pursue the opportunity. But happy to answer questions today, or to set additional calls up as needed. So let me stop there and thank everyone for their attention. Happy to take some questions, and happy to have Teresa join me for some of that Q&A conversation.